So guys, let's talk a little bit about contrast. What is contrast? Without looking at the titles of these images, which one of these is high contrast and which one is low contrast? What do you think? High or low? Yeah, basically it's the difference between the bright parts of an image and the dark parts of an image. With a lot of difference, we have what we call high contrast. With very low difference, we have low contrast. All right. Something like this, losing some highlight detail, filling in some shadow detail, that's okay, right? You know, if you're going for a very kind of stark sort of look, you'll often find in some outdoor scenes the skies kind of get blown out a little bit. We try to keep detail in all the parts of the image if we can. Now, on the other extreme, we've got this here. Is that wrong? Why does this look so flat and low contrast? Probably a foggy day, maybe a snowstorm. Can we change the contrast of images? We can, can't we? Let's say, for example, I wanted to make this image high contrast like that image. I'm going to call up a levels adjustment layer. And let's say I wanted to put some nice white highlights in here. Notice how this has a nice white background. We've got some highlight detail. This has kind of a washed out grayish background. And we have some nice blacks in here. This has kind of a washed out grayish black. Let's take a look at the histogram here. Look at that. Normally you expect a histogram to kind of start down here at the black point, make its way up, and then come down to the white point here. This one just kind of starts around here and it ends somewhere up there. What sort of information are we getting from this histogram? Just looking at this, what would you know from that image? Anything towards the right side of this mid-gray point is lighter than 50% gray. Anything towards this side is darker. Here's our white point, here's our black point. There's nothing all the way up to around here. So the darkest part of this image is somewhere just a little bit darker than mid-gray. So probably somewhere around here in the tree trunk is this part of the histogram. Up around here, this is the brightest part and there's no white. What do you think would happen if we took these endpoints and started pulling them inward? We're kind of reassigning those white points and black points. If I took this white point and pulled it to the left, what happens to the highlights in that image? Here they're kind of washed out in gray. This gives them a little bit of white contrast, a little bit of snap in there. If we grab that black point and pull it upwards a bit, now we have some nice deep shadows in there. Instead of that washed out grayish, we've got some nice deep shadows in there. And take a look at what we've done. We've basically said black, which used to be down here, let's reassign it to, in this case, 117. So what used to be 0, we've reassigned it to 117. And what used to be white, what's white in Photoshop? 255. What used to be 255, we pulled down to 224. So we've basically reassigned the black and white points, and we have now a high contrast image. Could we do the opposite to this one and make this one look the way this one used to? We could, couldn't we? Let's take a look at the histogram of that upper image. I'm going to throw on a levels adjustment layer again. And look at the histogram this time. The first one, remember it started here, kind of made its way up, came down, very kind of low contrast. Everything's kind of pulled in towards the center. This one, we have detail all the way down to black. And in fact, we can tell that these shadow areas are filling in because we've got a big spike on the end here, and it cuts off right on the edge. This would suggest that there's actually some tonality that should be on the left side here. But because that black point, that 0, is right there, all this has been cut off. If this had been a raw file, you could probably have pulled some of that shadow detail back, gotten that kind of rounded shape of the logs there. Same thing on the highlight side. You can see we have a flat spot. It's getting cut off, suggesting that there was probably some tonality to the right here, but that's been lost. Anything towards the right of that white point has become pure white. Again, if this is a raw file, you probably could have pulled in some detail into the sky, maybe a little cloud or something. You can imagine if you're shooting a wedding, very high contrast scene, a black tuxedo, a white wedding dress. If you're photographing it outside on a sunny day, very easy to start losing highlight detail. If you see that little spike, that little flat spot on the side, that suggests that there's actually tonality up there. To bring this to look like a foggy day like this one was, remember there was a big flat spot across there. How could we get a flat spot in here? We could grab this black point and pull it to the right, but we can't do that, can we? In theory, if we could take this black point here and pull it to the left, if we could pull it, let's say we've got about, what, 12 inches here. If we could pull this 12 inches to the left, we'd reassign black to here, which means what is currently black now would then become in between white and black. It would become 50% gray. But we can't pull this slider out of the window. What could we do instead? Well, look at this one here. This is the output level. If we grab this and pull it to the right, watch what happens. We can reassign our black point from 0 and pull that right up to 128 there. Now we've got that kind of, the fog is rolled in. You're kind of losing the contrast in that scene there. And same thing on the highlights. Instead of that crisp white sky, if you wanted to give it that kind of grayish washed out sky, we could pull this down a little bit. And in effect, we've reversed the contrast of those images. Now we have this nice stark black and white high contrast tree on the field over here. The fog is gone. Now this one has the fog rolling in. Nice gray sky. Let's play around with an image. Pop into the folder called Contrast, and let's say you've been photographing, these cross-country skiers. Take a look at the histogram on that. Let's use a non-destructive technique for this. So let's call up a levels adjustment layer. You can either do it from the adjustments panel or from that little white circle, that white and gray circle at the bottom of the layers panel. Throw on a levels. A curves would work too, but in this case we're just doing the endpoint, so levels is quite sufficient. And look at that histogram. What do we know from that histogram? Take a look down here. Do we have any deep shadow information? No, we got kind of a washed out gray for the darkest part. And same thing on the highlights. We got no pure white in there. I mean, it's snow. There should be some white. Clean it up. Look at the flat spot in there. Grab the black point and just close it up. Pull that black point up to the base of the mountain. Take that white point, pull that down to the base of the mountain. And take a look at what happens. Once you're done, turn that layer off and on. There's a before, and there's an after. You can see it kind of snaps up the contrast in that image. Now, is this, we say non-destructive in the sense that if the client called up and said, it's great, but you know what, it's a little bit too contrasty, maybe you can kind of flatten it out, make it look like a snowy day on the mountain. We could go back, double-click on that adjustment layer, and we could ease off on what we had done. But is this non-destructive? I mean, for non-destructive, we talked about the idea of not changing any pixels. So we haven't changed any pixels down here, but by pulling the endpoints in, does this have the same tonality as it would have if the raw file had been processed out, or if the actual scene had had nice deep shadows and nice white highlights? Remember the analogy I said when we're talking about bit depth, with 8 bits per color channel, in each of those red, green, and blue color channels, from the darkest black to the brightest white, you had, how many shades of gray was it again? From the darkest black, 0, to the brightest white, 256 shades all told, so 1 to 256, but they want black to be 0, so we start at 0, which means it only goes to 255. With 8 bits per channel, you had 256 shades of gray, and I said, imagine an elastic string, and on the string you have 256 glass beads, a black bead down here at 0, a white bead up here at 255, and if you're making a brightness adjustment, grab that middle bead and start pulling it left or right. It's the same thing as pulling the middle slider on the levels. You grab that middle slider and pull it left or right. Some of those beads got to pop off the string. You're losing shades of gray. What we're starting with here is a string where there's no beads in the first few sections across. And by moving those endpoints in, we're basically, okay, well, let's take that point here, and let's take that, the darkest bead to here, pull it down to 0. You're going to get some gaps in between those beads. Same thing when you take the brightest bead and pull that up to white. You've stretched those out. You're going to get some gaps in there. You're going to get some, not damage, it was already damaged in a way to start with, but if we look at the histograms on it, and we look at each individual channel, you can see those gaps that are starting to appear. So where these had all been tucked up here to here, we've grabbed and we've stretched it out, and we're getting those gaps appearing in there. So that makes it all the more important to keep everything as non-destructive as possible. Use the levels adjustment layer. So if the client called up and said, it's great, but can you ease it off a little bit? We can say, no problem. We'll just call up our levels here, ease that off. And if you look at those histograms again, you can see the damage isn't as severe as it was. Now, in the case of that tree that was on the field there, we made a pretty big change. That's a lot of stretching those beads out. And what can happen is over time, you might start noticing what we call banding or posterization, which is basically where instead of a nice smooth transition from dark to light, you end up with really noticeable steps, like this sort of thing happening. Have you guys seen this in any of your images yet? Yeah, if you do an extreme correction, sometimes even just a simple saturation correction. If you've got a sky that was almost gray and you're like, I want to make that sky blue, so you crank up the saturation in the sky, you can end up with these sort of staircasing effects happening simply because the closer things are to gray, the closer those numbers are together. Say it was like the sky was mid-gray, 128, 128, 128. Or let's say it was just slightly bluish, so 128, 128, 129. If you want to give that a really bluish sort of look, that blue is going to have to get quite a bit higher. But if there's only one level between the red and the green, when you push that blue up, suddenly you've got this big staircase gap, and you can see these bands starting to appear. So be careful in your images when you're making changes. First off, make sure your exposures are good, so you don't have to do extreme corrections like this, and try to keep everything looking as close to proper for the exposure as you can.